Clinton Bodycount is a disturbing and comprehensive collection of names of deceased individuals who each have some kind of connection to former President Bill Clinton or his wife, former Secretary of State and presidential candidate Hillary Clinton, many of which passed away either violently or under extremely mysterious and suspicious circumstances. The list contains the names of several dozen people of various ages from all walks of life, from journalists to military personnel to lawyers and political staff members, including several vehicular disasters. Now, I've always heard about the body count list over the years during my research into conspiracy topics, and I've even done a couple personal deep dives into some of the cases with seemingly very incriminating evidence. And trust me, some of these cases seem as though the victims were just straight up whacked for knowing too much. Like Mary Mahoney. In 1997, Mary had quit her job as a White House intern during Bill Clinton's presidency and had found employment working at Starbucks. In the pre-trial publicity surrounding Paula Jones' lawsuit against President Clinton, in which she claimed Bill had propositioned and acted inappropriately towards her, her lawyer, Mike Isikoff, made statements hinting that a former White House intern with the initial M, as in Mary, would be going public with her story of harassment taking place at the White House. Just a few days later, a gunman entered the Starbucks Mary worked at while the crew was closing up and executed Mary and her two fellow employees in an alleged robbery, although no money was taken. The three employees, Mary Mahoney, Emery Evans, and Aaron Goodrich, were found in the cold storage room by the morning crew, making it seem like a professional hit. But a couple of much more recent cases reignited my interest in the body count list. One of those would be the case of Brian Malinowski, the 53-year-old executive of the Bill and Hillary Clinton National Airport in their home state of Arkansas. Brian was promptly eliminated inside his home by the ATF just 90 seconds after they arrived with a search warrant earlier this year. He had also met with Arkansas state senators a week prior in Washington, D.C. on some very important airport business. The other more recent case was Christopher Sine, an award-winning TV news anchor in Birmingham and former Alabama college football player. Christopher was the journalist who originally broke the story about a secret, potentially illegal, infamous tarmac meeting between Bill Clinton and the U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch in the midst of Hillary's email and private server scandal in 2016. The expose he wrote about the meeting caused a massive nationwide scandal in the news, and in 2019 he released a book about the whole affair called Secret on the Tarmac. At around 8 a.m. on Saturday, June 12, 2021, he was found unresponsive in his home. His death was quickly ruled as self-inflicted, although no cause of death was ever publicly released. Christopher was a husband and father who actually turned down lucrative offers to work at bigger news stations in order to stay closer to his family and spend more time with them. And although many people suffering from mental health issues do tend to mask those issues from their loved ones and colleagues, Christopher's co-workers at the news station were completely blindsided and spoke about how just the day before his death, Christopher was lighting up the room and excited about news stories he was working on. We'll be diving deeper into those three stories and many others, because today we're going all the way back to 1977 and covering every single name on the list. Now, this list is massive, and after researching every single name on it, there's definitely some bizarre inclusions that don't seem to have any connection to the Clintons whatsoever, and some that are easily debunked. But there are undeniably entries on this list that are shocking and disturbing. So let me tell you about the sponsor that made this video possible, and then we'll dive deep into the Clinton body count list. Do you ever feel like you're being watched even when you're all alone? Maybe it's the existential dread of living in a world with an increasingly predatory internet. If you're watching this video, there's likely a lot more information about you on the internet than you'd like. There was about me as well, but thanks to this video's sponsor, Aura, that's no longer an issue. There's never been a more important time to think about your internet security needs, because recently it's come to light that hackers may have stole the social security numbers of every American citizen. Over 2.9 billion records were stolen from national public data, which provides personal information to employers and others doing background checks. These stolen records include a person's full name, address, date of birth, phone number, and most importantly, social security number. And members of this hacker group have reportedly released this information online for free. With everything going on in the world, this news came and went rather quickly, but I was furious that such a massive data leak could even take place. But I wasn't too worried because I use use Aura. Aura monitors your personal data, including your social security number, across millions of data points like the dark web and court records, to detect and alert you to potential identity theft. They also provide a ton of other features to keep you safe online, all inside of one app. You can go to my link to try 14 days for free, and that'll be enough time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data has been exposed. I highly recommend you do this right now, because not only is national public data not doing anything to help you, they'll probably never face any repercussions for this leak. I'm not leaving myself or my family open to any kind of data breaches, and if you don't want to either, you can go to aura.com/Parasyke to try 2 weeks for free. And a massive thanks to Aura for sponsoring this video. In 1977, Bill Clinton started his 2-year term as Attorney General in Arkansas. The list alleges that during this period, Clinton had an affair that led to a pregnancy with a 26-year-old college student named Suzanne Coleman. On February 15, 1977. No autopsy was allowed, and Suzanne had allegedly told close friends that the baby belonged to Clinton. As for the legitimacy of the story, there's almost no information on the internet pertaining to Suzanne Coleman in Arkansas in 1977, aside from debunking articles claiming the story about her and Bill is definitely not true. But we do know that she was a real person, and that Bill Clinton was likely her law professor at the University of Arkansas prior to his election in 1977. The story seems to originate from George Bush Sr.'s re-election campaign against Clinton in 1992. A 1992 article by Thomas Ferraro, archived on UPI.com, details that President Bush had filed a Federal Election Commission complaint against Floyd Brown, a hardball political ad man that had been lobbying for Bush's own re-election. According to Bush, Floyd Brown dug up these details about Suzanne and tried to sabotage Bill Clinton's campaign by exploiting Suzanne Coleman's suicide. Bush issued the complaint to clearly separate his official campaign for re-election from Floyd Brown's attempts to assist him, quoted as saying Floyd's attempt was despicable and had no place in the American political system. As far as I could tell, Clinton never commented on the situation. Although we can verify Suzanne Coleman was a real person and did tragically pass away in 1977 and may have been a student of Bill Clinton's, it does seem likely that the rest of the story may have been fabricated as a re-election strategy. So I'm marking Suzanne Coleman's inclusion on the list as questionable. In 1986, we have two names, Judy Gibbs and the infamous Barry Seal. We'll start with Judy. Judy Gibbs was a Penthouse model and celebrity call girl. She appeared in the December 1979 issue of Penthouse and worked at a bordello, a fancy word for brothel, in Fordyce, about an hour drive from Little Rock, Arkansas. The bordello had two businesses, selling time with women and blackmailing any rich and famous people that may visit. The building was wired with hidden cameras, taking photos of any and all customers and their activities. In 1985, Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton was serving as chairman of the National Governors Association, with his sights set on the presidency. He also, allegedly, was a frequent visitor of the Fordyce bordello. The story goes that he was photographed in situations with Judy Gibbs that would be very threatening to his political aspirations. In December of 1985, Judy was caught up in a drug sting and was cooperating with authorities afterwards during the investigation. But according to the conspiracy theory, she may have attempted to use her connection to Bill Clinton as a way out. On January 3rd, 1986, Judy called the fire department to report a fire at her boyfriend Bill Puterbaugh's house where she lived, saying, "Bill Puterbaugh's house is on fire. Hurry, y'all, hurry." Puterbaugh's body was found next to a window, and bizarrely, Judy's body was found near the bed, still clutching the telephone, both appearing to have passed out and died from smoke inhalation, according to the report. No cause for the fire was ever found, or if it was hidden from inquiring minds. Local fire chief Roy Mosley had no explanation as to why the lovers were unable to get out of the house before it burned down. Quote, "The only reason I can think why they didn't is they were so overrun with smoke, so quick and so fast. It was a real tragedy. As far as residential fires go, that was the worst we've had." According to the list, Bill Clinton's bodyguard Barry Spivey made some wild claims about the incident. Barry claimed that he was with Bill on his plane as they flew over the area Judy's house was located in, and that Bill pointed down towards the area and related to him that he knew Judy and had her issue of Penthouse on hand and showed Barry pictures of Judy. Some sources on the internet claim Barry was a corporal in the Arkansas State Troopers, but I could find zero trace of Barry Spivey's existence anywhere. Barry's story about his experience with Bill Clinton bringing up Judy Gibbs on the plane seems to stem from a 1999 Newsmax report, but of course Newsmax archive only goes back to the year 2000. So either this is a fanciful point made up as a frightening detail of the Judy Gibbs story, or it's true and Barry Spivey's existence has been all but bleached completely from the internet surface. Judy's sister Martha told the Daily Mail in 2016, "I've always been convinced that Bill Clinton was responsible for the fire, but I have no proof. And what would happen if I had proof? You can't touch those people." Puterbaugh's son Randy tells a similar story to Martha, even though the two have barely spoken since a couple days after the fire. There are so many pieces of the puzzle. I believe it is a possibility that Bill Clinton was involved in their deaths. I know I wish I hired my own private investigator, but I didn't, so I guess I will never know. So Judy Gibbs died alongside her boyfriend Bill Puterbaugh in a mysterious and savage house fire, and their surviving family members still to this day seem to harbor feelings that Bill Clinton was linked to their deaths due to Judy's profession. I'm marking this one as suspicious. On February 19, 1986, cartel hitman Miguel Velez gunned down 46-year-old private pilot Barry Seal outside the Salvation Army housing complex in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in a brutal drive-by attack. Who Barry Seal was, why he was at that Salvation Army housing complex, and why he was a target of the cartel in the first place would all be tied to one of the biggest scandals in modern American history. To really oversimplify a very complex situation, in 1979 a group called the Sandinistas overthrew the Nicaraguan government and established their own government. The United States didn't like this because the Sandinista movement had close ties to Cuba and the Soviet Union, aka communists. So, the USA began backing an insurgent group of oppositional rebels in Nicaragua called the Contras, formed in 1981 to resist the Sandinista government. According to President Reagan, the Contras were the moral equivalent of America's founding fathers. And like the founding fathers, they needed guns. By the way, I'm just going to say this ahead of everything I'm about to say. Allegedly. The U.S. support came in the way of weapons being smuggled into the hands of Contra fighters by the CIA, and Barry Seal was one of the pilots flying the guns down to South America. But he was also bringing something back. Lots and lots of cocaine. For years, Barry was smuggling guns from the United States down to South America, picking up cocaine from the Medellin cartel. Then he'd fly back over the border into the United States and throw parcels of the illicit substance out into the Louisiana wildlands, where cartel members would pick up the parcels and take them back down to Florida for distribution. According to several journalists and investigators, all on orders from and with the protection of the CIA. Barry was running his entire operation from a private airport in Mena, Arkansas. He was eventually caught due to an extensive joint operation by the FBI, Arkansas State Police, and IRS. That's when a judge made the baffling decision that instead of going to prison, Seal would instead be ordered to stay at the Salvation Army housing complex in Baton Rouge. And he was forbidden from hiring any form of security. So basically they named their patsy publicly Barry Seal and then hung him out to dry. But what does this all have to do with the Clintons? Well, first of all, Seal was running his operation out of a private airport in Mena, Arkansas. With CIA and cartel business going down in a tiny airport in Arkansas, it's hard not to presume Bill knew about it. But according to L.D. Brown, Clinton's role was much more significant. L.D. was an Arkansas state trooper that worked closely as part of Bill Clinton's security detail. According to L.D.'s book Crossfire, Bill actually got him into the CIA, and his handler was none other than Barry Seal. The first time the two met, the first words out of Seal's mouth were, "How's the gov?" obviously referring to Governor Clinton. LD basically rode shotgun on some of Barry Seal's flights from Mena to South America, but claims he was absolutely shocked when he realized what they were doing was smuggling drugs for the CIA, and he was furious with Bill for roping him into the situation. When he approached Bill about it, the governor had a huge smile on his face and asked, "Are you having fun yet?" but hadn't thought LD would have such a negative reaction. Clinton assuring Brown, saying, "Don't worry, that's Lassiter's thing, and that name Lassiter will be very important a little bit later." LD felt completely betrayed and terrified to be caught up in the smuggling ring. But in 1985, he was called into an office to meet with someone that identified themselves as Felix Rodriguez, Barry Seal's boss. Felix, in reference to Barry Seal, told LD, "Don't worry about him. will take care of him. And a year later, Seal was violently gunned down. So in reference to the body count list, I'm marking the Clintons' involvement in Barry Seal's death as not directly responsible, but probably somewhat involved, suspicious. In 1987, we have the beginning of a seemingly massive conspiracy and cover-up, beginning with two teenage boys, 17-year-old Kevin Ives and 16-year-old Don Henry, being struck by a train late one night in Arkansas, in a case widely referred to as the Boys on the Tracks. Almost a dozen mysterious deaths lead back to this case. On August 23, 1987, at around 4 a.m., a nearly mile-long Union Pacific train was traveling at around 50 miles per hour near Crooked Creek Trestle in Alexander, Arkansas. The crew of the train began to take notice that something was laid on the tracks ahead of them directly in their path. Although the train did not have time to stop before colliding with whatever was on the tracks, it's important to note that all four crew members on the train all distinctly remembered seeing what they believed was two figures sleeping on the tracks, covered up partially with a green tarp. The train was obviously very loud, and if you've ever been near a train as it goes by, you know it's impossible to ignore the rumble and vibration of the ground and tracks, and the train was sounding the whistle to try to wake the boys up, but they didn't move, making it pretty obvious that they weren't asleep but already dead. And there would be a lot of evidence supporting that fact. The first piece of evidence supporting the idea that the boys were almost certainly already deceased when the train ran them over is very gruesome, but it is important to note. When a train hits a living person, the blood that exits that person is a light reddish pink mist, and the body parts react in a certain way. But if the body that the train comes into contact with has already been deceased for a period of time, the blood is a much darker purple and coagulated, which was the case with the boys on the tracks. So much so that when the crew exited the train to check out what they had struck, although incredibly gruesome and a horrible tragedy, they could pretty easily tell that the boys had already passed away a while before the train was ever involved. Around 30 minutes later, the police and emergency responders arrive, and the EMTs come to the same conclusion as the train crew, that the boys were definitely passed away before the collision. And that's where the suspicious behavior really began. Even though the train crew and EMTs agreed that the boys were most likely passed away when the collision occurred, the police started to treat the deaths as accidental anyway, basically just gathering up the remains and cleaning up the scene. But they didn't even do a particularly good job or treat the scene with much respect, as they left one of the boys' feet on the tracks for 2 full days. And for some strange reason, that green tarp that all 4 crew members reported seeing miraculously disappeared, and the police actually insisted that the train crew hallucinated it. Gee, that's not suspicious at all. The boys were identified by their dental records as Kevin Ives and Don Henry, best friends that had grown up together. That night, the boys had met up to go spotlighting at around midnight. Spotlighting is a form of hunting where one guy holds the flashlight and one guy holds the rifle. Their favorite location for doing so was the area around Crooked Creek Trestle. The state brought in high-profile medical examiner Fahmy Malek to give the community, and most importantly the families, some much-needed closure and answers as to what had led to this tragedy. That is not what Dr. Malek provided. According to Dr. Malek, what led to the boys being laid out on the tracks was that they had consumed somewhere in the ballpark of, in his words, 20 weed cigarettes each, and had fallen asleep on the tracks. Such a deep slumber that they couldn't be awakened by the impossible to ignore rush of a massive mile-long train speeding towards them, or the piercing shrill tone of the train's whistle. Also ignoring all the physical evidence that the boys were clearly not alive when the train hit them. The boys' families absolutely did not buy this explanation. So in April of the next year, 1988, Kevin's body was exhumed and another autopsy was performed, this time by Atlanta medical examiner Dr. Joseph Burton. Burton discovered that Kevin had actually died from a crushed skull prior to being placed on the tracks. It was also discovered after Don Henry's body had been exhumed that he had been stabbed in the back multiple times. Dr. Burton also claimed that based on his examinations, it seemed that Dr. Malek had taken measures to intentionally destroy parts of the remains, possibly in order to hide evidence. At the time, there was major public backlash against Dr. Malek's apparent errors, but none other than Governor Bill Clinton stepped up to bat for Malik, excusing that he was tired and stressed out. At this point, local prosecutor Dan Harmon emerged, offering his services to the boys' families and reassuring them that he would do everything in his power to figure out what happened. Well, I can tell you now, over 30 years later, that no one has ever faced justice for what happened to the boys. So if they didn't fall asleep on the tracks due to their usage of weed cigarettes, what did happen? And what does all of this have to do with the Clintons? Based on multiple witness testimonies, this is, in my opinion, the clearest way to describe what actually happened that fateful night. The most simple way to begin is that there were allegedly 3 separate groups of people out near the tracks in the woods of Arkansas that night. One group was the 2 boys that were spotlighting, Kevin and Don. Another was a group of teens who were out that night looking for a rumored weed field. And a third group ties back into the previous segment. Remember Barry Seal? Well, although he was gone by this point, his trafficking operation was alive and well, and was most likely still being propped up by Arkansas government officials and possibly still the CIA. So according to multiple witness testimonies, the third group that was out near the tracks that night, they were looking for a planned package drop from a low altitude flight, just like how Barry Seal did it. Although the boys that would end up on the tracks didn't know it, their favorite spotlighting location, Crooked Creek Trestle, was also a landmark used for these package drops. Allegedly, the head of the group that was searching for the package drop was none other than Dan Harmon, the prosecutor that promised to figure out what happened to the boys. The story goes that Kevin and Don were spotlighting when they bumped into the group looking for the package led by Dan Harmon. Something happened, a shot rang out, and the boys were actually able to escape to a nearby store. After making it to the store, they were approached by 2 police officers, Jay Campbell and Kirk Lane, who, according to witnesses at the store, attacked the boys and forced them back into the car and then drove them back towards the train tracks. And some theorize that the boys were actually killed by those police officers who were allegedly complicit in the drug smuggling operation, and then they brought the bodies back to the train tracks on Dan Harmon's orders. Suspiciously, during Dan Harmon's investigation into what happened to the boys that we now know he very well may have had killed, several witnesses came forward to the authorities with testimony about what may have happened. The testimony would then make its way back to Dan Harmon, and wouldn't you know it, bad things just kept happening to these witnesses. Keith Coney was allegedly with Kevin and Don the night of the incident. He told relatives that law enforcement officials were responsible for the boys' deaths. 2 days after telling his relatives, in May of 1988, when riding his motorcycle, witnesses saw him fleeing from another vehicle in a high-speed chase. He eventually crashed and passed away, and his death was ruled as an accident. Except, according to some of the responding officers, his throat had been slashed by the time they made it to the scene. Keith McCaskill also claimed to have seen Kevin and Don near the tracks that night. In November of 1988, he turned over what information he had regarding that night to Deputy Prosecutor Richard Garrett. The interaction must have gone poorly, as he then immediately went and told his family what he knew, and also related to them that he felt as though he had made a grave mistake by telling Garrett. McCaskill was absolutely convinced that he was going to be killed, so much so that he arranged his own funeral and started to tell his friends and family goodbye. And he was right. Within days of telling Deputy Prosecutor Garrett what had happened, he was found stabbed 113 times. In January of 1989, Gregory Collins was scheduled to appear in front of a grand jury to testify about what had happened to Kevin and Don. Before the date arrived, he was killed by a shotgun blast to the face. It was ruled a suicide and no autopsy was performed. Booney Berden, a friend of both Greg Collins and Keith Coney, was rumored to know exactly what had happened at the tracks that night, most likely hearing the story directly from his eyewitness friends. In March of 1989, Booney vanished without a trace and he has never been found. In April of 1989, Jeff Rhodes told his family that he knew too much about the boys on the tracks. His body was found with multiple severe gunshot wounds to the head. His hands and feet had been partially removed with a saw-like instrument, and his body was partially covered in burns. Richard Winters was actually at one point a suspect in the death of the boys. He was set up to be robbed in July of 1989. During that interaction, he received a shotgun blast to the face, and he died. Mike Samples was a grand jury witness in the case and was allegedly part of the group searching for the illegal package drop. He was gunned down much later in 1995, just before he was expected to take take part in an investigative journalist piece about the case. Jordan Kettleson was also allegedly a witness to the boy's death. He was found shot several times in the front seat of his pickup truck in 1990, and in probably the most terrifying and psychotic instance of one of the witnesses being taken care of, we have James Dewey Millam and the return of Dr. Malik. Millam evidently had information about Don and Henry. His body was found decapitated and his head was nowhere to be found. Dr. Malik was brought back into the fold and he actually determined that Millam died from an ulcer. And the reason that his head was gone was because his dog had eaten it. The head was later found intact in a trash bin a couple blocks away, to which Malik insisted that the dog must have regurgitated it, clearly seeing Malik being used again to sweep a mysterious death under the rug. So once again, what does this all have to do with Bill Clinton? Well, it would seem as though through various connections and mentions by hardened criminals in the drug trade and by investigative journalists, CIA assets and government officials, along with Barry Seal, had built and maintained the whole Mena, Arkansas pipeline to South America. Bill Clinton, during his tenure as governor, allegedly knew full well that all of this activity was going on, and basically allowed, if not facilitated, the creation and continuation of this illegal and deadly business. One perfect example of this is Dr. Fahmy Malak. After Malik's first bizarre declaration that the boys had most likely fallen asleep on the tracks due to their usage of weed cigarettes, and the fact that based on the secondary autopsies, it seemed as though he may have desecrated the boys' bodies in order to obfuscate the truth, he started to receive some major public backlash. Clinton flexed his power and defended Malik, excusing these incredibly disturbing events, saying Malik was just tired and stressed out. And then, after the whole thing was basically swept under the rug, Clinton actually introduced legislation that wound up seeing Malik receive a $30,000 raise. There is no explaining or excusing that. That is extremely suspicious. And remember in the previous segment about Barry Seal, when Clinton told L.D. Brown that that whole thing was Lassiter's thing? Well, Mr. Lassiter is a very enigmatic and mysterious individual and has direct ties to this case and to Clinton. Lassiter was obviously involved with the CIA and with Barry Seal's business, and even had his own South America import business with his own airport in New Mexico. He was also a licensed bond dealer in Arkansas, putting him directly in touch with the local criminal element. Dan Lassiter was also the subject of both FBI and DEA investigations in the 1980s, which led to his arrest alongside Roger Clinton, Bill Clinton's brother, for cocaine distribution. During one of his interviews with the FBI, he for some reason mentioned that Jay Campbell was a close friend. And if you remember, Jay Campbell was one of the police officers that was seen basically abducting the boys from outside the store and that allegedly took them back to the tracks. And he was one of the two main suspects throughout the investigation. In 1997, Dan Harmon, the prosecutor who was in charge of the investigation, was arrested and charged federally for racketeering, extortion, and drug conspiracy charges, although he nor anyone else would ever face justice for what happened to Kevin Ives, Don Henry, or the other several people that lost their lives in the aftermath. Because of all the intricate connections Bill Clinton shares with the Mena, Arkansas cartel and various bad actors involved with this case, I'm marking his involvement here as highly suspicious. Danny Casolaro was an American freelance writer born in 1947. In the late 80s, he was working on a project he called The Octopus, covering a wide-ranging and expansive conspiracy theory regarding many of the topics and key players we've already talked about today, namely the weapon and drug running operation pipeline, the two ends of the pipeline being the Contras in Nicaragua and Mena, Arkansas. Danny was convinced that the Octopus was a network of unelected officials acting outside the confines of the law, working towards global control, utilizing worldwide surveillance and illegal operations such as assassinations, foreign government coups, destabilization of foreign nations, and enrichment through drug and weapon trades. He began his investigation of the Justice Department's theft of a software package called PROMIS from a company called Inslaw. PROMIS stood for Prosecutors Management Information System. It basically collected information from every law enforcement database automatically to present a single picture of financial transactions and generate lists of suspects suspects from multiple sources. A piece of technology that, if used for good, would be absolutely catastrophic if used against an illegal smuggling ring protected by government officials. And this seemed to be a story that the powers that be absolutely could not have getting out to the public. On August 10th, 1991, Danny Casolaro was found dead in room 517 of the Sheraton Hotel in Martinsburg, West Virginia, each wrist slashed 10 to 12 times. He was 44. After his death was ruled a suicide, his family protested the ruling, arguing that this was highly unlikely. Danny was traveling to West Virginia in connection to his octopus story, and he told his brother that leading up to the trip, he had been receiving strange, harassing, and sometimes threatening phone calls late at night. He also made a point of telling his brother that if anything happened to him during his trip to Martinsburg, that it definitely was not an accident. Danny also had a well-known fear of blood and was even afraid to take blood tests because of it. The family stating that it was incomprehensible that even if Danny had committed suicide, this would be the last method he would choose. I think it's highly likely that Danny Casolaro was assassinated, and even though I doubt Clinton was the shot caller this time around, his name undoubtedly would have been on Danny's list as someone that would be implicated in this conspiracy. C. Victor Razor II was a Washington lawyer, chairman of Mobile Telecom Technologies Corp., whose subsidiary, SkyTel Corp., was an international paging company used by federal police agencies like the FBI. He was also co-chairman for the Clinton for President campaign and was a major player in the Clinton organization. On July 30th, 1992, Victor, along with his 22-year-old son and a handful of other passengers, were on a small plane headed for Alaska. The plane experienced some kind of mechanical or pilot error and crashed even though the weather conditions were perfect. Victor and his son Montgomery, along with 5 other passengers, unfortunately died when the plane crashed, but there was one passenger survivor and one of the pilots survived as well. According to the list, Victor was a target because he had a planned meeting with John Hillier, an employee at NBC and a freelance journalist who was building his own story about the Mina cartel. John Hillier is a mysterious and important name that emerges several times on the list, so we'll definitely be talking more about him later. 30 years later, it's nearly impossible to confirm that Victor Razor and John Hillier had this plan to meet, but planes do crash, and a plane crash that has survivors kind of makes me question if this was a legitimate assassination attempt. But that skepticism may be put to the test when you realize that the Clintons know 41 people that have died due to aviation accidents, which is basically statistically impossible. Until we see more, I lean more on the side of the crash that took Victor Razor and his son's lives as probably being an accident. Paul Tully was a very successful political strategist. He authored several key strategies for Bill Clinton and the Democratic Party, including a very effective strategy to make the party competitive in presidential elections again. On September 24th, 1992, Paul was found dead in a hotel room in Little Rock, Arkansas, of unknown causes, and there was no autopsy, but some news agencies reported that the cause of death was either a heart attack or stroke. After his death made the news, Bill Clinton said, "A dear friend and trusted advisor, Paul had one of the nation's greatest political minds and one of its biggest hearts." At the time, the LA Times called Tully a beefy, intense, chain-smoking political operative. So although there may be more to the story, considering the fact that in 1992, in the United States at least, the leading cause of death in men was heart disease, it seems highly likely that Paul Tully did die of natural causes. Who the list names as Paula Grober was actually Paula Gober. Paula was an accomplished speech interpreter working for the Office of the Deaf and Hearing Impaired in 1977, when she first interpreted a speech for Bill Clinton. She went on to interpret throughout his political career, all the way until just after his election in November of 1992. The last speech she ever interpreted was Bill Clinton's presidential acceptance speech. On December 9th, 1992, her car veered off the road in a one-car accident. It was reported in the news that she was thrown exactly 33 feet from the vehicle. Bill commented on the tragedy through a spokesperson. "Hillary and I extend our sincere sympathy to Paula's family. I had the privilege of working with her over many years." Although there's no clear motive as to why the Clintons would need to get rid of her, young attractive women around Bill Clinton do seem to have a habit of dying mysteriously. Jim Wilhite was a high-powered businessman, the chief executive officer of Entex Inc., and vice chairman of its parent company, Arkla Inc., both natural gas companies. In 1992, after Clinton's election, Bill appointed Arkla Inc.'s chairman and CEO, Thomas Mac McLarty, to the position of chief of staff in his cabinet. Bill and Mac McLarty had been close friends since childhood. Less than a week after McLarty became a member of the cabinet, during a family ski trip, witnesses found Jim Wilhite unresponsive on the slopes, with massive head trauma, and he would die days later during surgery. Now, like many other names on the list, it's easy to excuse this as an accident. Ski accidents do happen, it can be dangerous, but the timing feels so suspect. It's starting to feel like an uncomfortable amount of people that may have had intimate knowledge about the Clintons or Clinton associates met a sudden demise leading up to and just after Clinton's election as president. Accidents do happen, but in the world of high-powered cutthroat business, it's not hard to imagine that Jim Wilhite had some kind of dirt on his CEO, Mac McLarty, and his sudden death a week after McLarty became Clinton's chief of staff to me just feels too suspicious. On March 12, 1993, Marine One landed on the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the USS Theodore Roosevelt. The Roosevelt was headed into uncertain waters, about to set off to the Balkans to take part in Operation Deny, in which it would conduct airstrikes against Serbian positions for 2 months. Clinton visited the carrier and made a speech about the conflict before leaving. He was on the carrier for a total of just over 3 hours. Well, according to the list, 12 of the bodyguards that escorted Clinton during his visit on the carrier would all die all in aviation accidents all within 4 months of each other. Just a couple weeks after the visit, on March 26th, an E-2C Hawkeye AEW aircraft crashed into the Ionian Sea off Italy's coast shortly after being waved off from landing on the Roosevelt carrier. No official reason for the crash was ever determined, and according to the list, the entire crew on board were all Clinton's escorts during his trip to the Roosevelt. However, none of the news stories about the crash or about the search for the crew ever mentioned any of the crewmen's names, which is kind of interesting for 2 reasons. It's interesting that the list claims that all of these crewmen were with Clinton during the Roosevelt trip, because how could they possibly know that if we don't know the names of the crewmen? But also, deaths in the military are extremely well documented, and suspiciously, the Naval History and Heritage Command website that lists all casualties of U.S. Navy and Marine Corps personnel killed or injured in accidents doesn't list the 1993 crash at all. Less than 2 months later, on May 19th, 1993, a VH-60N Black Hawk helicopter belonging to the presidential fleet was on an inspection flight near the Marine base in Quantico, Virginia, when it crashed violently. All 4 crew members on board were killed. And again, according to the list, all 4 crew members in this crash were also escorts during the Roosevelt trip. The list also details a 3rd incident, which is the exact type of inclusion that annoys me on this list, so I'll just read it exactly how it's written, and maybe you'll see why it's hard to take seriously. 3 other men who had flown Clinton to the Roosevelt for that visit also died later in a helicopter crash, died 1993. I'm going to need a bit more than that if I'm going to somehow connect this to a vast overarching conspiracy, or to the topic at hand, the Clintons. Like, you can't just say, also 3 other guys died, trust me. I know we don't have names for the Ionian Sea crash, but with that one, at least I have enough information to confirm that it did happen and was directly connected to the USS Roosevelt. There's no way to confirm whether or not these particular Marines and naval personnel were the security detail during Clinton's visit. I did look it up. I couldn't find any information on what security was provided outside the Secret Service. But if they were his security detail, of course, this would be really suspicious. It's just kind of impossible to figure that out or not. Before we move forward, I need to set the stage for what would become one of the biggest scandals that a president would ever be implicated in, and the first time a sitting president has ever given testimony in a civil case in which he's the defendant. On May 8th, 1991, Paula Corbin Jones, a civil servant, attended the annual Governor's Quality Conference at the Excelsior Hotel in Little Rock, Arkansas. According to Jones, she was approached by an Arkansas State Trooper, Danny Ferguson, and asked to report to Governor Clinton's hotel room at the Excelsior. When she arrived, Clinton allegedly propositioned her and exposed himself to her. 3 years later, David Brock wrote a story printed in the American Spectator that detailed her claims. On May 6, 1994, 2 days before the statute of limitations would expire, Paula Jones filed a sexual harassment lawsuit against President Clinton. Following a series of civil suits and appeals through the U.S. District Court and the U.S. Court of Appeals from May 1994 to January 1996, Clinton v. Jones eventually reached the United States Supreme Court on May 27, 1997. The case was finally settled on November 13, 1998, with the judge ruling in Clinton's favor, with Justice John Paul Stevens citing that Jones was not able to prove that she had been injured personally or in her career by Bill Clinton. Although, 1 year later, Judge Wright found Bill Clinton in contempt of court for giving intentionally false testimony in the Jones v. Clinton case and required him to pay a fine of $90,000. So let's go back to Danny Ferguson, the police officer that allegedly brought Paula Jones to Bill Clinton's hotel room. Just a few days after the lawsuit was filed in May of 1994, Kathy Ferguson, which was Danny Ferguson's ex-wife, was found passed away in her living room. She died of a gunshot wound behind her left ear, although she was right-handed and the gun was found in her right hand. She apparently left a suicide note, but her body was found in the living room right next to a bunch of packed luggage, as though she was about to leave town. Her fiancé, Bill Shelton, who was an Arkansas state trooper, was found passed away at Kathy's gravesite exactly 1 month later, also with a bullet hole behind his ear. He allegedly left a note saying, "I can't stand it anymore." According to the list, the local police chief was highly suspicious of the circumstances surrounding Bill's demise, but I couldn't find any news articles from the time to verify this claim. I think it's pretty easy to imagine that if you are named in a massive lawsuit along with the sitting president, you're probably going to get a visit asking if anybody close to you knows anything. I think in this case, that person unfortunately was Kathy Ferguson, and I could see her state trooper fiance not wanting to go quietly. In my opinion, these two deaths are highly suspicious. Former Washington, D.C. council member John Augustus Wilson claimed to have information on Whitewater, a political controversy that implicated Bill and Hillary and their associates, Jim and Susan McDougal, in real estate and bank fraud and various financial crimes. John Wilson was allegedly trying to make contact with L. Jean Lewis, an investigator who was rapidly chasing down leads in connection to the failure of Madison Guaranty Savings and Loan, a bank owned by Clinton Whitewater partners Jim and Susan McDougal. On May 18, 1993, before Wilson was able to get in touch with Lewis and whistleblow about whatever he knew about the Whitewater situation, he was found hanged in the basement laundry room of his home by his wife. The death was, of course, ruled as a suicide, but it's my opinion that Wilson's death was highly suspicious. Paul Wiltshire was a Washington attorney and yet another person investigating the gun-running operation out of Mena, Arkansas, during Bill Clinton's tenure as governor. According to high-powered attorney Janet Reno, Wiltshire had delivered a 105-page affidavit to her, including evidence to corroborate his story just 3 weeks before his death. The evidence never saw the light of day, which may have something to do with Janet Reno becoming Attorney General during Clinton's presidency. And on June 22, 1993, Wiltshire was found passed away, sitting on the toilet inside his apartment, and Wiltshire's cause of death was never publicly released, which is strange if he died of natural causes. Vince Foster was an attorney who served as deputy White House counsel during the first 6 months of the Clinton administration. He was found dead from a gunshot wound to the head in Fort Marcy Park, about a 15-minute drive from the White House, on July 20th, 1993. The death was of course ruled as a suicide right away. The media would portray Vince as a White House aide who had done this possibly because he was about to be caught up in a White House scandal known as Travelgate, which consisted of the firing of several White House staff and had gotten a little bit of backlash from the media. But it wasn't quite that simple. Foster was actually another childhood friend of Bill Clinton, going all the way back to kindergarten, Bill making several public statements regarding experiences they shared as kids. Foster was made partner at the Rose Law Firm in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1974, just in time to be in a very powerful and helpful position during the Mena cartel days. Just to be clear, Foster was never implicated in any of the investigations, but it's hard to imagine being that close to Clinton that he had no idea what was going on, being a lifelong close friend and collaborator to Bill, and working at a law firm in Little Rock, while we basically know that Bill was allegedly running or very high up in the Mena cartel. And of course, once Bill secured the White House, Foster was brought in as part of the inner circle. The conspiracy theory that is all but confirmed is that Vince Foster had actually been subpoenaed to testify during the Whitewater scandal, the one that implicated the Clintons in several financial crimes, and that because Vince Foster knew way too much, he was taken care of. During the federal investigation, it became known that the White House had strangely waited for about 30 hours before handing over a torn-up suicide note from Foster's briefcase. According to White House officials, it took them 30 hours to deliberate if and when they should hand over the note because they wanted to make sure the family had been made aware first, which for me is a detail that the more I think about it, the stranger it gets. Why would the White House have the note at all? Was the briefcase that contained the note with Foster in Marcy Park or in Foster's office at the White House? In In either case, how would White House officials come across the note before investigators? Well, we actually have the answer to that. We know Vince Foster knew something, and that something was probably on paper, as both his office in the White House and his office at the Rose Law Firm in Arkansas were tampered with the night of his death. On March 5th, the Tampa Bay Times published an article that I was able to find an archive of titled "Courier, I Shredded Foster Documents," which details how Clayton Lindsay, just 19 years old at the time, told the LA Times that he and his roommate Jeremy Hedges both worked at the Rose Law Firm as couriers at the time of Vince Foster's death. The night Foster's body was discovered, they were hurriedly ordered to shred any and all of Vince Foster's documents that more than likely pertain to the Whitewater scandal. And on the other hand, several news outlets reported that Patty Thomason, another one of Clinton's partners from the Arkansas days, along with White House counsel Bernard Nussbaum and Margaret Williams, Hillary's chief of staff, were all three tossing Foster's office in D.C. the night of his death, allegedly looking for the combination to his safe. Foster's death was kind of the breaking of the dam for a lot of people as far as the suspicion surrounding the Clintons' shady business practices going mainstream. It's my opinion that the Clintons' involvement with Vince Foster's death is extremely suspicious. According to his wife, when Jerry Luther Parks heard the news of Vince Foster's passing, he turned to her and said, "I'm a dead man." And 2 months later, he was. His death would not be made to look like a suicide or an accident, however. He was violently gunned down in his car. A gunman fired one shot through the rear window, striking Parks, then walking up to the side window and firing 3 more shots, all striking him. Jerry was on Clinton's gubernatorial security team for years in Arkansas and supplied all the bodyguards during his presidential campaign and the following transition of power. Not only did President Clinton allegedly owe Parks an outstanding debt of $81,000, Parks had also been keeping a dossier on Clinton containing everything he had witnessed while working for him, from the Mina cartel dealings all the way to Clinton's sexual escapades, with pictures and dates. What Jerry believed would be his life insurance file probably led to his death. According to his wife, he had made several large cash transfers to Foster, and after his assassination, federal agents showed up and removed all Jerry's files and the family computer. Jerry Parks' death was obviously an assassination, which in my mind makes it very suspicious. On September 9th, 1993, Stanley Hurd, the chairman of the National Chiropractic Healthcare Advisory Committee, as well as the chiropractor who had personally treated Bill Clinton's mother, stepfather, and brother, and member of Clinton's advisory council, boarded a plane with his personal lawyer, Steve Dixon, at the Dulles Airport. Shortly after takeoff, their plane began experiencing issues, so it landed back at the airport. They then proceeded to rent a different plane, and shortly after that plane took off, it crashed due to an onboard fire. The 2 men were burned beyond recognition, adding them to the growing list of Clinton associates to die in aviation accidents. I'm also going to add that the list has these deaths marked as occurring on October 10th, 1993, but this is incorrect, as the deaths occurred on September 9th, 1993, as seen here in a Washington Post article from the next day. On November 29th, 1993, according to Kathleen Willey, during a confirmed afternoon meeting between herself and President Clinton in the Oval Office, he forcibly embraced her, kissed her on the lips, and groped her. The next day, her husband, Ed Willey, a real estate attorney and Clinton fundraiser, died from a shotgun blast deep in the Virginia woods. There was no note, but the death was of course ruled a suicide. So either he was taken care of to try to keep Kathleen quiet, or he did so because he believed the rumors about his wife, which were that Kathleen had been pursuing some kind of relationship with Bill Clinton for some time, following him to events and wearing clothes she thought he would like, and made the allegation as retaliation when it didn't happen. Clinton would allegedly deny the allegation, telling Monica Lewinsky that it was absurd because Kathleen was a small-breasted woman, which wasn't his thing. This one is at least mildly suspicious. Okay, so let's talk about Gandhi Baugh. On January 8th, 1994, Gandhi Baugh allegedly jumped out of a window of a multi-story building. According to the list, Gandhi was a close associate of Governor Clinton and the Mr. Lassiter named in the various investigations into the Mina cartel. However, I could find almost no information about Gandhi other than various right-wing blogs repeating the blurb from the list and his grave. I'm marking this one as inconclusive and unconfirmed. James Bunch was an influential Texan that was allegedly running a prostitution ring out of Austin, Texas. He was found dead from a gunshot in an apparent suicide in February of 1994. Bunch, of course, kept an extensive list of every client that had visited any of his properties. His inclusion on the list inferring that, of course, Bill Clinton was on that list of clients. However, I was unable to find any information connecting the two whatsoever. Not saying they weren't connected, there's just not really that much to go on here. Herschel Friday was an Arkansas attorney and Clinton fundraiser. On March 1st, 1994, Herschel lost control of the plane he was piloting. It crashed near his Faulkner County home, and he passed away. Although Herschel was a Clinton benefactor, he was also a 72-year-old man. And small plane crashes are incredibly common, happening nearly twice a week in the United States due to just running out of gas. It's my opinion that this one isn't very suspicious. Stanley Huggins was a partner at the Memphis law firm and was investigating the Madison Guarantee Savings and Loan case. He had also previously worked in the same law firm as Hillary Clinton in Little Rock. Stanley had been at a cotton carnival party on Friday night. He was supposed to escort his wife all week during the 7-day event, but suddenly told her he couldn't as he had to leave because something important had come up. The word circulated throughout the party that he had some secretive issue that had to be resolved. Soon after that, family friends were told by his wife that he had flown up to Northeastern University to give a speech on that Saturday. He was checked into the provided dorm room that he was going to stay in, and the university employees said that he seemed fine. When they called up to his room later in the day and he didn't answer, they went to check on him and he was dead. The cause of death was declared as viral pneumonia. His wife apparently tried to get the medical records, but they were allegedly sealed by Janet Reno of the Clinton administration. Over that weekend, his Memphis office was broken into and all of his files were stolen. The 300-page report about his death and the ensuing break-in was never released. That's all according to the list. But once again, I couldn't find any information on Stanley Huggins whatsoever, which doesn't mean that it's not real or didn't happen. It's 100% possible that anything mentioning his name was scrubbed from the internet years ago. I checked multiple search engines and every mention of his name always led directly back to the body count list, so in my opinion this one is unconfirmed. Calvin Walraven was a 24-year-old key witness in a drug trafficking court case, in which the defendant ended up being sentenced to 10 years in prison. 2 weeks after his testimony ended, on July 30th, 1994, Calvin was found alone in his apartment in Little Rock, Arkansas with a gunshot wound to the head. A Little Rock police spokesperson said that no foul play was suspected and the death was ruled as a Importantly, the defendant in the case Walraven testified against was Jocelyn Elder's son. Jocelyn Elder had just been nominated as the Surgeon General of the United States by President Clinton. People in the drug trade often die suddenly and violently, and Calvin had just outed himself as an informant against a very well-connected individual. I don't think it's hard to believe that this outcome would have happened regardless of Clinton's involvement. Either way, in my opinion, his death is still suspicious. On September 8, 1994, U.S. Air Flight 427 left O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, heading for Palm Beach with a stopover in Pittsburgh, loaded with 132 passengers. While approaching runway 28R at the Pittsburgh airport at approximately 7:03 p.m., the 737 crashed in Hopewell Township, Pennsylvania. There were no survivors. This tragedy is on the list because one of the passengers that died on Flight 427 was Paul Olson. Paul was a federal witness in investigations regarding drug money corruption in Chicago politics, and he was actually on his way home from 2 days of FBI interviews when his plane crashed. The list also details that the September 15th, 1994 issue of the Tempe Tribune newspaper reported that the FBI suspected that a bomb had brought down the plane, but I was unable to find that article on any archive sites. And although the corruption case that he was testifying in may have some way involved the Mina cartel or implicated Clinton somehow, that would be pure speculation. This is one of the several names that the list doesn't seem to try very hard to explain the connection between the departed and the Clintons. Florence Martin was an accountant who worked as a subcontractor for the CIA, and according to the list, she made it out of the whole Mina cartel Barry Seal days with the paperwork and PIN number to an account that had been set up in the name of Barry Seal for $1.46 million at the Fuji Bank in the Cayman Islands. In October of 1994, she was found dead with 3 gunshot wounds to the head at her home near Mabel, Texas. And according to the list, just after her death, the money was switched out of the account and into an account located in the Virgin Islands. Her murder remained unsolved for almost 20 years, but in 2012, DNA linked 50-year-old Jack Wesley Melton to the crime scene. He pled not guilty. 2 years later, he was found guilty of capital murder. Jack Melton was sentenced to 30 years for burglary with intent to commit another felony in 1988, but he was paroled in 1991. So he was either reoffending, burglarizing Florence Martin's home when it escalated to murder, or he was paid to do it by some shady government organization and used as a patsy. However, if he was going to be used as a patsy, I don't think it would have taken 20 years to link him to the crime. On October 29th, Francisco Martin Duran approached the fence overlooking the north lawn of the White House and unpacked his SKS semi-automatic rifle and promptly began firing at a group of men wearing dark business suits on the White House lawn. Duran fired 24 rounds, striking a man he believed at the time to be President Clinton, before being tackled to the ground and held until the Secret Service arrived. A Brazilian businessman vacationing in DC at the time of the attack videotaped the entire thing. He remained in the United States for an additional 13 days and continued his vacation before returning to Brazil on November 11th, but agreed to return to the United States for Duran's trial in December. 9 days after he returned to Brazil, he was dead. Karani died from a flesh-eating Streptococcus bacteria, according to his doctors, who themselves described the death as sudden and mysterious. His doctor, Dr. Fabio Lenardi, said, "Karani appeared Friday with an acute, rapid, and violent infection due to no apparent cause and died shortly afterwards. In 14 years of practicing medicine, I have never seen anything like it. The bacteria was extremely violent and aggressive." Now, obviously, this would be an unorthodox way of getting rid of somebody, but it is possible. But why get rid of a witness to a White House shooting? Maybe it has something to do with the videotape. Is it possible that he caught something on video that he wasn't meant to? I did find some old footage of the event and noticed a very strange detail. When I first saw this, I laughed. Like, did someone just push their stroller and run away? But I watched it over and over and over, and I don't even think this is a real baby. I don't know how this connects to Karani, but I just think it's a bit odd that there's just a fake baby in the one piece of footage I was able to find of the event. Like so many entries on this list, it's kind of inconclusive or unclear how or why the Clintons would have been involved, but regardless, something's fishy here. Fake baby. Alan G. Witcher oversaw Bill Clinton's Secret Service detail until 1995, at which point he was transferred to the Murrah Building in Oklahoma City. On April 19, 1995, the Murrah Building was blown up, allegedly by Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, and Alan G. Witcher was among the 168 people that were killed in the blast. His inclusion on the list, of course, infers that what he witnessed while working alongside President Clinton ended up in him getting taken out. There are many other compelling theories about the Oklahoma City bombing. One of those theories pertains to Terrence Yeakey, another name on the list. Terrence Yeakey was a sergeant in the OCPD and was one of the first responders after the bombs went off, personally saving at least 4 survivors. According to the conspiracy theory, Terrence allegedly reported secondary explosions going off inside the building during the event, a fact that would heavily clash with the official story. 1 year after the bombing, on May 8, 1996, just days before he was set to receive the Medal of Valor, Terrence's body was discovered in a field outside his hometown of El Reno. He died of a gunshot wound to the head, which was, of course, quickly ruled as a suicide, although his autopsy revealed that the shot came from a downward 45-degree angle, and that Terrence sustained cuts to his wrists, arms, and neck before his death. The easiest way to describe how this could happen is that there was a struggle, and that Terrence was then placed on his knees with the shot coming from someone who was standing above him. A friend and fellow officer, Jim Ramsey, speculated that Terrence may have been driven to committing suicide because of the guilt of not saving more people, and that he was troubled because he had recently been barred from seeing his 2 young daughters by his ex-wife. However, his ex-wife disputed this, saying in an interview that she believed her ex-husband was murdered, and that they were on such good terms that they were actually considering getting remarried. According to CNN, among those that knew Terry, not many believed that he had done this to himself. No note was ever found, and many of his family friends and fellow policemen claimed he was assassinated because he was conducting a private, independent independent investigation into the bombing. Once again, due to those facts and just the incredibly suspicious nature of the Oklahoma City bombing in general, Terrence Yeekey's and Alan Witcher's deaths are both incredibly suspicious. Their deaths are included on this list because many believe that the Murrah building was the main target of the bombing that day, because one of the offices in the Murrah building contained documents that would implicate the Clintons in the Whitewater scandal. This, of course, is impossible to verify, especially in 2024, and Reuters fact-checked this conspiracy theory and they claimed that it's false. Well, mystery solved. On August 18, 1996, a military plane carrying a Secret Service agent, 8 Air Force crewmen, and an armored vehicle used by security officers in the presidential motorcade took off from the Jackson Hole, Wyoming airport following a stay at Clinton's Wyoming retreat for his pre-birthday celebration trip. The plane was headed for New York, where the agent and the armored car would be meeting up with the president for his birthday. 3 minutes after takeoff, the plane slammed into the side of Sheep Mountain, also known locally as Sleeping Indian Mountain. The plane exploded in a fireball so bright and violent that it was visible to Teton Village, a resort town 20 miles away. There were no survivors. A party of 28 searchers arrived on foot and on horseback hours later, but due to the location of the impact taking place above the timberline and the ferocity of the crash, the plane was traveling over 200 miles per hour and had nearly 40,000 pounds of fuel on board. The crew found only smoldering fragments. After the search for survivors was called off, President Clinton was asked to comment on the tragedy. Shortly after returning to the White House from Wyoming, but before leaving for his birthday party in New York City, President Clinton commented that the loss of the agent and the crew were, quote, especially painful to us because they worked for me and did an invaluable service, and I am very sad about it. Although I'm sure this crash was included on the list because of the close working relationship between Clinton, the agent, and the crew, and due to the well-documented history of safety in C-130s, also known as the Hercules. This crash actually took place during a particularly unsafe period for C-130s, as this was the third fatal Hercules crash in a 15-month period. Due to that fact and the fact that there are no extenuating circumstances shown in the list to try to provide any motive, this one definitely seems accidental. John Hillier was an NBC cameraman that in the early 1990s became involved with several others in the search for the truth about the events that led to the deaths of Kevin Ives and Don Henry, the boys on the tracks, while also working on his own personal journalistic investigation into the Mina cartel. Hillier also worked alongside filmmaker Pat Matroschiana as a cameraman and producer behind the two documentaries, The Circle of Power and The Clinton Chronicles. Both documentaries were claimed to be investigations into the, at the time, several mysterious deaths surrounding the Clintons and the Mina cartel. John died under some extremely mysterious circumstances in 1996. And before I tell you how, I just want to say that it was extremely difficult to source this information. Almost any mention of John Hillier has been wiped from the internet, other than his name being mentioned in a couple of New York Times articles lumping him and Matroschiana in with others that were investigating the Clintons, calling them Clinton crazies. In 1999, Matroschiana was interviewed after he had become the defendant in a multi-million-dollar lawsuit over one of the films he had made about the boys on the tracks called Obstruction of Justice. It was in that documentary that Matroschiana named Jay Campbell and Kirk Lane as suspects. Campbell and Lane were the two very suspicious police officers that witnesses described seeing load the boys back into the police car and taking them back towards the train tracks. And after the documentary was released, they actually sued Matroschiana for naming them as suspects. In an interview with Sarah Foster for WorldNet Daily about the lawsuit, he made the following statement about his former collaborator, John Hillier. John thought his life was in danger, and we had experienced a lot of harassment when we were doing the films. We were followed, we were harassed, so he was very concerned. He called me from Atlanta, where he was living, and told me that he had heard there was a drug that could be given to someone, and it would look like he died of a heart attack. I started laughing and said, "John, you're so healthy. It would never come off like a heart attack." He said he knew, but figured that's what they do. A couple of months later, he phoned and said he had some vital information. We figured our phones were tapped and that we couldn't discuss it over the phone, but planned to make arrangements to meet. 3 days later, John died of a heart attack in the dentist's office. Died right there in the seat. About a year ago, his widow sent us some videos he had made of himself, saying he was afraid he was going to be killed. I don't know if he was murdered, but it was strange. I find the death of John Hillier and the lack of information about him available online to be highly suspicious. The next set of mysterious deaths are all connected to Ron Brown, an Army veteran and chairman of the Democratic National Committee that served as Secretary of Commerce in Clinton's cabinet. Brown was starting to feel the pressure in 1996 as he, his son, and his business partner and closest political advisor, Nolanda Hill, became targets of a federal independent counsel investigating a series of fraudulent transactions that benefited the three of them financially. According to the theory, Brown went to Bill, pleading his case and hoping the president would throw around his weight and get the charges dropped. When Bill allegedly denied Brown, Brown used his one remaining trump card in a last stand play. He told Clinton that if he had to, he would reveal the president's treasonous dealings with China, news of which had yet to break. Bill Clinton's friend and ubiquitous Democratic fundraiser Johnny Chung told federal investigators that he funneled nearly $100,000 from the communist Chinese military to the Democratic campaign in the summer of 1996. The money was handed to Chung by the daughter of the top commander of China's People's Liberation Army, General Liu Huaqin, who was also one of the top 5 members of the Chinese Communist Party. Allegedly, there was a prior $100,000 donation to the DNC in June of 1994 by the CEO of Laurel Space and Communications, Bernard Schwartz. Schwartz then joined Ron Brown on a trip to China that led to a $250 million telecommunications deal for Laurel's satellites to be launched by Chinese rockets, which was a major violation of U.S. law at the time. This would be a major pay-to-play scandal of the highest order if it was to ever get out. In the midst of the looming federal investigation into Brown's own shady business dealings, and just after he had allegedly threatened to expose the Clintons' illegal deals with China, on April 3, 1996, Brown was sent on an official trade mission to Bosnia. On approach to Croatia's Dubrovnik airport, the U.S. Air Force CT-43 carrying Brown and 34 other people crashed into a mountainside. Although many news organizations reported that everyone on the plane died instantly, this was not the case. The plane did crash, but U.S. Air Force Technical Sergeant Shelley Kelly was able to surviving for over 5 hours at the crash site in the pouring rain, only to pass away immediately upon being loaded into a helicopter to fly her to safety. There was also a major political dust-up over a wound that Ron Brown had sustained to the top of his head. It would be remembered in history as a wild conspiracy theory, but at the time, those pushing for an investigation were not conspiracy theorists. Some people, including Kwesi Mfume, head of the NAACP at the time, and Representative Maxine Waters, chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus, had written federal officials to ask for more data on the suspicious circumstances of Ron Brown's death, insinuating nationally that it may have been a homicide, the theory being that there were multiple survivors then being taken out by a cleanup crew. And what would transpire after the plane crash would make things even more suspicious. 5 days after the crash, Niko Junik, the air traffic control chief in Dubrovnik at the time of the crash, was dead. The news reported that according to local police and U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Ray Shepard, Niko had killed himself in his home. U.S. and Croatian authorities declined to comment on any connection between the possible suicide and the crash. But Croatia's aviation inspector would later confirm that at the time of the crash, all navigation instruments in Dubrovnik were operating functionally. Police also refused to release any details surrounding the scene of Niko's death. In my opinion, the death of the 33 passengers, Ron Brown, Shelley Kelly, and Niko Junik, are highly suspicious. In the middle of October 1997, Norman businessman Ron Miller was scheduled to testify before a congressional committee. According to several sources, Miller was prepared to implicate President Clinton's chief of staff, Thomas F. McClarty III, in Oklahoma-related scandals. First Lady Hillary Clinton was exposed to, at minimum, severe embarrassment if Miller testified. But Miller's sudden death on October 12, 1997, prevented his testimony against McClarty. Although his death would eventually be ruled as a sudden illness, it was a particularly mysterious and suspicious illness. After several months of alleged anonymous harassment, during which Miller was subjected to threats over the phone and in person, Miller became suddenly ill on Thursday, October 2, 1997. On October 4th, he was admitted to Norman Regional Hospital, suffering from severe flu-like symptoms. 4 days later, his business associate and close friend, Larry Evans, who was a board member at Integris Baptist Hospital, considered by many to be the finest Hospital in Oklahoma, had him transferred there due to his rapidly worsening medical situation. On October 12th, he was dead. Throughout dozens of tests, none of the doctors at either hospital could tell what actually killed Ron Miller. After his death, Baptist referred his case to the Oklahoma Medical Examiner's Office. Despite their own extensive tests, the ME's office declared Miller's death as a medical mystery. Some suggested ricin poisoning as a possible cause, but the ME's office specifically tested for that and found no ricin antibodies. If one was to not accept the medical mystery conclusion, the next best theory seems to be anthrax inhalation. Miller became ill on Thursday, October 2nd, experiencing what he believed to be a bad cold. His condition worsened, and then he believed he had a really bad flu. He was experiencing high fever, persistent cough, memory loss, lethargy, and chills. This is consistent with the early warning signs of airborne anthrax, but an accurate diagnosis at this stage would require, in the words of literature, a high degree of suspicion. Doctors first treated Miller with Timentin, a penicillin derivative, and then more powerful antibiotics like Azactam and Kefzol, enough to knock out a severe flu or severe cold, but none of which would cure anthrax infection. By 2 o'clock the following Monday, on October 6th, Miller suddenly reported to the nurses that he felt so much better and appeared to be on his way to recovery. On Tuesday, Miller's temperature returned to normal, and it began to look like he would be released the next day on Wednesday. But then on Wednesday, October 8th, his condition worsened dramatically, his temperature spiking to 105 degrees. Medical literature reports that in many cases of inhalational anthrax, the patient often experiences a period of rapid recovery, followed by a rapid relapse with increased difficulty in breathing, profuse sweating, cyanosis, shock, and death in 2 to 3 days. Eerily, one day before Miller expired, a Dr. Frost called one of the nurses that was caring for him and suggested that he had most likely been poisoned, but there was no Dr. Frost. No Dr. Frost was listed in the metropolitan Oklahoma City area, and neither the hospital nor the family had ever heard of Dr. Frost. When referred from Baptist to the ME's office, Miller's death was classified as a possible threat to public health and died under suspicious circumstances, and agents of the FBI were in contact with the ME's office during his autopsy. The initial ME report was pending investigation. This was then changed to natural causes, but then after a challenge by Michigan investigator Stephen Dresch, the cause of death was actually changed back to unknown. It is my opinion that Ron Miller's death is highly suspicious. We talked about the Paula Jones lawsuit earlier, the woman who Bill Clinton allegedly exposed himself to during the Governor's Quality Conference in 1991. And in 1997, we start to see more possible ramifications and fallout of Paula Jones' lawsuit and the president's alleged reaction to being exposed by someone other than himself. On the night of December 15th, 1997, 52-year-old Postal Service worker Theodore Williams Jr. was driving along Interstate 95, north of Richmond, Virginia, when something caused him to veer off the highway, possibly after a collision with another vehicle. A state trooper arrived on the scene and tended to Theodore, who appeared to be uninjured. Theodore then, apparently without cause, ran off the shoulder back towards the highway and was almost immediately struck by a speeding semi-truck. According to an article from the Washington Post at the time, the death was ruled an accident. The reason Theodore is on the list? Because he was the brother of President Clinton's personal secretary, Betty Curie, who would turn out to be a major player in the Monica Lewinsky and Paula Jones cases. As we already covered Paula Jones, if you didn't already know, Bill Clinton also had a long-running, intimate relationship with White House intern Monica Lewinsky during his time as president. During their relationship, Betty Curie, as Clinton's secretary, would basically act as a go-between between Clinton and Lewinsky, often bringing gifts from Clinton to Lewinsky's residence. So she was obviously well aware of the inner workings of the president's secret life. Although the list leaves the motive unclear as to why Betty would need any kind of motivation to stay quiet, the night of her brother's death, after the relationship had already been broken off, Clinton allegedly called Monica at 2 a.m. to tell her about Theodore's passing, even though he wasn't really known to either one of them, and also to allegedly tell her that she may have been named in the Paula Jones case, as it had been leaked that a secret major witness would be giving testimony. The witness was only named as M in the documents to protect her identity, so Clinton was probably a little worried that this would be Monica. A seemingly bizarre call for the president to make, and it's not difficult to imagine a possible threatening undertone. The list also claims that Curie's sister was also killed in an automobile accident, but I was completely unable to verify that claim. Although the connection to Clinton is tenuous at best, and there were later reports that Theodore had trace amounts of marijuana and alcohol in his system, which was, of course, used to explain his running away from the traffic stop. Clinton's alleged call to Monica Lewinsky that night makes this feel a little bit suspicious. In what seems to be a baffling inclusion on the list, the next name we have is Christine M. Mirazian. Christine was a 28-year-old biology intern in Washington, D.C. On August 1st, 1998, Christine attended a barbecue at another intern's house in the area surrounding Georgetown University. When the rest of the party's attendees left the barbecue to go dancing, Christine declined as she was just getting over the flu. She began walking home through the Georgetown neighborhood, but at around 11 p.m., an individual grabbed her and dragged her into the woods, and a nearby man heard and called out, asking if she was okay. When she didn't respond, he did nothing. The next day, she was found dead in the woods. She had been raped and bludgeoned with a 74-pound boulder. When police reached out to the surrounding area, a second witness came forward, saying he had seen Christine walking home and that she was being followed by the unknown subject, and he was able to assist the authorities with a police sketch. In 2011, the FBI and Parabon Nanolabs genealogy team used DNA from Christine's crime scene to create a list of 5 potential suspects. On November 13th, 2019, police located one of those people, Giles Warwick, a 60-year-old man who was working as a landscaper in Maryland at the time of Christine's murder. Warwick's DNA actually matched several crime scenes from the 1990s in the area, all connected to a serial criminal known at the time as the Potomac River Rapist, who had assaulted several young women in the Washington, D.C. area. 11 days before Giles Warwick's trial was set to begin, he was found dead in his cell in an apparent suicide. So, although the case is closed and has been very well documented throughout the years, Christine Mirzian's name was included on the list as being a White House intern, which she wasn't, and that she was killed because of her middle initial being M, and links it to being the same reason for Mary Mahoney's death, the unknown witness being named M in the Paula Jones trial. This is a baffling choice, and from what I can tell, there is no connection here. The reason I included this in the video is there are quite a few of these examples on the list that really seem to have zero connection to the Clintons, but this one was just such a clear example with also a ton of press over the years. With how many names on the list that seem to have passed away in extremely suspicious circumstances and having very real, tangible connections to the Clintons, I really don't understand why they include names like this. Jim McDougal was the banker, central figure, and cooperating witness in the Whitewater investigation that implicated the Clintons in a banking fraud scheme that ended up costing taxpayers $60 million. For his part in the crime, McDougal was originally convicted for 18 counts of felony bank fraud and sentenced to 81 years. But after agreeing to cooperate with independent counsel Kenneth Starr's investigation, his sentence was reduced to just 3 years. Starr was initially appointed to investigate the suicide of Deputy White House counsel Vince Foster and the Whitewater real estate investments of the Clintons, so you could see how his investigations might have made Bill a little nervous. And to add onto the pressure, Jim McDougal was also working on his memoir titled Arkansas Mischief. On Saturday, March 8th, 1998, Jim McDougal was placed in solitary confinement for refusing to provide a urine sample as part of a random drug test. Prison guards were supposedly monitoring inmates in solitary every 30 minutes. McDougal was supposedly in good health at his 10:30 a.m. check the next day, but 25 minutes later he was found in distress and died shortly after from cardiac arrest. Although there are several means of snuffing out life and making it appear to be cardiac arrest, Jim did suffer from an artery hardening condition and bipolar disorder and was 57, which is still relatively young, but with other contributing factors, it is easier to understand that this could have been natural causes, or it could be the exact explanation as to how his death could have been avoided. Due to a report obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, it actually came to light that McDougal couldn't provide the urine sample when asked because of his medications. And as he was being moved to solitary to punish him for that, he was complaining that he was feeling very ill, but he was not seen by any of the prison doctors. And during the move, the prison guards refused to go back into his cell to get his heart medication because they didn't want to wake his sleeping cellmate. It later came out that he was attempting to produce the urine sample for 5 hours, and the whole time he was complaining of feeling dizzy and even vomited before being moved to solitary confinement as punishment. So in reality, it would actually seem as though Jim McDougal was murdered via neglect by the prison staff. In my opinion, due to his cooperation with Kenneth Starr and the mistreatment by prison staff, Jim McDougal's death is highly suspicious. On March 1st, 1997, 17 tornadoes hit Arkansas, killing 25 people. One of those tornadoes hit Johnny's transmission and tore apart some of the junked cars that sat in its back lot. In a bizarre turn of events, the trunk of one of those cars contained a box of documents pertaining to the Whitewater scandal, including a $27,000 check from Madison Savings and Loan to Bill Clinton. Keep in mind that in 1996, Clinton swore under oath that he never received a dime from Madison Savings and Loan. Johnny LaHone Jr. of Johnny's Transmissions retrieved those documents and turned them over to the authorities. Madison Savings and Loan was actually the bank that was owned and managed by Jim McDougal in the previous segment. When Jim was questioned from the prison about this check's discovery, he stated that immediately concurrent with the check's discovery, he started receiving a lot of heat from his jailers, and that he felt as though he was a prisoner of the executive branch. A year later was when McDougal died in solitary confinement, and just 3 weeks after his death, Johnny LaHone Jr. was dead too. Johnny left a gas station in Little Rock, Arkansas at around 1:20 a.m. and hopped into his black Corvette. According to witnesses, after he started his car, it took off like a shot, drove at high speeds for less than a quarter mile before violently slamming into a telephone pole, which of course killed him. Now, of course, car accidents happen, but there are also a lot of cases where cars are tampered with to cause this exact thing to occur. And due to his discovery of the $27,000 check and his death's proximity to Jim McDougal's death, I'm definitely feeling like this one is a bit suspicious. Charles Wilborn Miller was the vice president and board member of Alltel. Alltel was a landline wireless and general telecommunications services provider from 1983 until 2016, when the company was dissolved by AT&T. But in the early 1990s, they were developing a piece of technology which they would eventually sell to the US government called the Clipper chip. The Clipper chip was truly one of the first pieces of advanced Big Brother technology, at least as far as the public knows. The chip, officially known as the MYK-78, was intended for use in secure government communication devices, but it also had another application. It quickly became apparent to privacy advocates that the technology could be used to basically access any civilian or military communications at any time. The Clinton White House argued that the Clipper chip was an essential tool for law enforcement. When others suggested it could be a tool for terrorists, the administration said it would actually increase national security because the government could listen in on their calls. In 1994, Matt Blaze, a researcher at AT&T, published a major design flaw that would allow a malicious party to tamper with the software. That flaw seemed to be the last nail in the technology's coffin, and by 1996, the Clipper chip was no more. On November 17, 1999, Charles Wilborn Miller, 63 at the time, was found dead of a gunshot wound to the head in a shallow pit about 300 yards from his ranch house in Little Rock. Police found a .410 gauge shotgun and a Ruger 357 revolver submerged in water in the pit, and investigators concluded that the Ruger was the weapon used by Miller to kill himself. However, 2 rounds from the revolver cylinder had been fired. It's possible that Charles knew there was much more to the Clipper chip project than the public was aware of, and though it was said to have been dissolved and never used, we now know for a fact that the government has access to all personal communications and every device in the country using much more sophisticated technology. Due to his involvement in the Clipper chip project and the multiple weapons and multiple expended rounds found in the pit that his body was found in, it's my opinion that Charles Wilborn Miller's death is suspicious. But once again, the list got the date of death wrong, marking it as January 12, 1999, which is when some news outlets picked up and circulated the story of his death, so yeah. In the early summer of 1999, Hillary decided it was her time, and that she would run for the Senate seat in New York the following year. Although she didn't announce officially until February of 2000, it was thoroughly rumored that the seat basically belonged to her as soon as she decided she would have it. But the rumors were also swirling that John F. Kennedy Jr. would also be running as a Democratic candidate for the very same seat, and that is some pretty tough competition. At approximately 8:38 p.m. on July 16, 1999, JFK Jr., along with his wife Carolyn and her sister Lauren, took off in his Piper Saratoga light aircraft en route to Martha's Vineyard. JFK Jr. had received his pilot's license the year prior, so he was piloting the aircraft. He had made that flight once before, and that was at night too, but he was flying with a safety pilot that previous trip. He checked in successfully with the control tower at the Martha's Vineyard airport, but the plane was reported missing after it failed to arrive on schedule. The news spread that JFK Jr.'s plane was missing, and the search began, but for days, found nothing. On July 18th, the Coast Guard declared that the rescue effort was now over, and the search for the wreckage and bodies would now begin. Over the next couple days, fragments of the plane were found using sonar, and on the afternoon of July 21st, the bodies were found. Kennedy was a new pilot, without a ton of experience. He had about 36 hours of flight experience in that aircraft. 9 of those were at night. The news immediately spread that it had been a dark and hazy night with low visibility. And Kennedy was a licensed pilot, but he wasn't instrument certified. Many new pilots can fly by themselves just fine, as long as they can use visual cues. But on a dark and hazy night with low visibility, a pilot must rely on his instruments, which reportedly would have been difficult for Junior. But then it came out that the hazy, poor visibility conditions were from Essex County, New Jersey, where he took off from. The conditions near the crash site at Martha's Vineyard were clear skies at or below 12,000 feet with a visibility of 10 miles. A slightly suspicious discrepancy. The rampant conspiracy theory on certain forums is as follows. JFK Jr.'s plane did not crash. It exploded midair. 10 witnesses heard the explosion. 5 hours after his plane blew up midair, President Bill Clinton ordered the Navy to retrieve the wreckage, destroy the flight logs, cremate the bodies without the consent of the Kennedy family, and throw the ashes into the sea. And this was all documented in the secret official investigation report. Of course, there's no links provided to anything to source that, but I did find that Senator Ted Kennedy requested the burial at sea, saying it was his nephew's wish to be cremated and his ashes spread amongst the waves. About the plane exploding, I'm unsure where the 10 witnesses figure comes from, but there was one credible witness, an angler fishing for striped bass from an old boardwalk on Martha's Vineyard, a skilled trial lawyer named Victor Probonik. According to Victor, he heard a loud impact like a bomb up in the sky. At first, he believed it could be the military setting off explosives above No Man's Island, a practice they had quit years before. Other than that, you just have nameless eyewitnesses that either heard an explosion or saw a flash, but I was unable to find any other names to back up either claim. According to his instructors, JFK Jr. was a well-trained and talented pilot. It is true that he required further training to make unassisted IFR or instrument flight rules flights, but it's also true that he was cleared to fly under visual flight rules by air traffic control. It's merely speculation that the flight should have been categorized as an instrument flight rules flight. John F. Kennedy Jr.'s sudden death was possibly the most impactful event to ever happen to the Clintons. Hillary took the Senate seat and held it for 2 terms, before going on to become the Secretary of State for 8 years, while both her and Bill wielded power and influence through the Clinton Foundation and became very, very personally wealthy as a direct result. And as we all know, political power is very helpful for shielding you from criminal investigations and potential consequences. Although the official story is fairly solid, the motive and implications surrounding JFK Jr.'s death are so clear, I can't help but call it at least somewhat suspicious. Sometimes cover-ups are effective. Gary Webb was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who exposed CIA drug trafficking operations in a series of books and reports for the San Jose Mercury News. He basically fully exposed with detailed evidence and testimony everything we covered at the beginning of the video regarding the CIA bringing in massive amounts of cocaine to the US in order to raise untraceable funds to finance the plot to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. He also published an explosive series titled Dark Alliance, which exposed the same drug ring, selling tons of cocaine to the Crips and Bloods in LA, opening a pipeline of drugs between Colombian cocaine cartels and black neighborhoods in Los Angeles. This series sparked major protests and congressional probes, as mainstream media outlets denounced the series for its volatile nature, as if you shouldn't tell the truth if it sparks public outrage. Years later, declassified CIA files showed the agency used a ground base of already productive relations with journalists to counter what it called a public relations crisis. The media tried to ruin Webb. He was demoted at Mercury News, so he quit and continued the work in his book Dark Alliance, the CIA, the Contras, and the crack cocaine explosion. Gary Webb's journalism incited investigations into the illegal smuggling ring at both the Justice Department and a CIA internal investigation, who released their findings to the public on July 23, 1998 and January 29, 1998, respectively, both of which corroborated certain aspects of Webb's story, but calling the details details in his story exaggerated. But the damage was done. Webb's career was over. But that didn't stop him from continuing to dig for the truth. On December 4th, 2004, Gary Webb was found dead in his home with 2 gunshots to the head. After a local newspaper reported that Webb had died from multiple gunshots, the coroner's office received so many calls asking about Webb's death that Sacramento County Coroner Robert Lyons issued a statement confirming Webb had died by suicide. Webb's ex-wife, Susan Bell, told reporters that she believed Webb had died by suicide. Quote, "The way he was acting, it would be hard for me to believe it was anything but suicide," she said. According to his ex-wife, Gary had been unhappy for some time over his inability to get a job at another major newspaper, and he had sold his house the week before because he was unable to afford the mortgage. Due to the fact that Gary Webb exposed one of the most scandalous criminal plots involving the government ever, implicating government employees in felonious activity going all the way up to President Clinton, and the fact that he legitimately died from 2 gunshots to the head, it's my opinion that his death is highly suspicious, no matter what his ex-wife may have to say. On July 10th, 2016, 27-year-old dedicated DNC voter expansion director Seth Rich was walking home from his local bar when he was shot twice in the back. Thanks to a gunfire locator, police arrived only a minute later and got Seth to a hospital, where he died shortly later. The police would claim that his death was the result of an attempted robbery, and residents in the neighborhood noted that it had been plagued by robberies lately, but nothing of Seth's was taken, and the suspects were never found. His death spawned a massive rush of conspiracy theories revolving around Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, and Julian Assange. Here's why. In the lead up to the 2016 Democratic primary, an absolute battle broke out between candidates Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders for the Democrat nomination. Bernie Sanders led a massive grassroots campaign, raising a record-breaking $44 million in campaign funds, overshadowing Hillary's fundraising by $15 million. But Hillary had something Bernie did not: the head of the DNC in her pocket. WikiLeaks eventually leaked emails proving collaboration between Hillary and DNC head Debbie Wasserman Schultz, directly strategizing how to get Bernie Sanders out of the way, which, to be clear, is cheating. Emails between Hillary, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and other DNC officials read, wondering if there's a good Bernie narrative for a story, which is that Bernie never ever had his act together, that his campaign was a mess. Specifically, Debbie Wasserman Schultz had to call Bernie directly in order to get the campaign to do things, because they'd either ignored or forgotten to do something critical. Another read, Bernie is someone who has never been a member of the Democratic Party and has no understanding of what we do, and he isn't going to be president. Hillary even strategized that if he couldn't be brought to heel, they should pressure him on his faith and force him to make it clear once and for all whether or not he was Jewish or atheist, either of which they apparently felt would lose him votes. The email showed a clear misconduct on behalf of the DNC and collusion to rob millions of Democrat voters of their choice. But how did WikiLeaks get these emails?
Whistleblowers go to significant efforts to get us material, and often very significant risks. As a 27-year-old, works for the DNC, who was shot in the back, murdered just 2 weeks ago for unknown reasons as he was walking down the street in Washington. So
that was just a robbery, I believe, wasn't it?
No, there's no finding. So
what are you suggesting? What are you suggesting?
I'm suggesting that our sources take risks, and they become concerned to see things occurring like that.
But was he one of your sources then? I mean,
we don't comment on who our sources are.
But why make the suggestion about a young guy being shot in the streets of Washington?
Because we have to understand how high the stakes are.
So it would appear that Julian Assange, founder and head of WikiLeaks, almost outright says that Seth Rich was killed for handing over these leaked emails to WikiLeaks. The conspiracy theory being that Seth Rich was a true believer in the democratic process and a devoted DNC member. Seth was also raised Jewish and studied Hebrew in school, so some theorists claim that the collusion based on pressuring Sanders around his Jewish faith had angered Seth. In my opinion, the death of Seth Rich is highly suspicious. However, several news organizations such as Snopes and factcheck.org stated that the theories were false and unfounded, and Seth's parents denounced the conspiracy theorists and called them disgusting sociopaths. On July 6th, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested by the FBI NYPD Crimes Against Children Task Force at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey on sex trafficking charges. He was taken to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York City to await his trial. The day of his arrest, a dozen FBI agents searched his Manhattan townhouse, finding a massive amount of incriminating evidence, including thousands of suggestive photographs of partially or fully nude females, with some of the photos being confirmed as containing underage girls. Also found was a locked safe, filled with compact discs with handwritten labels, with descriptions like young name plus name. But the evidence didn't just incriminate Epstein. Many of the names included on those compact discs alongside young girls belonged to prominent figures, like famous celebrities and politicians. One of those was heavily rumored to be Bill Clinton. According to visitor logs, Epstein was welcomed into the Clinton White House on 17 occasions, often bringing women, including convicted child trafficker Ghislaine Maxwell. A photo also went public of Shantae Davies, a Jeffrey Epstein trafficking victim, giving Bill a massage in a private airport, preceding a humanitarian relief expedition in Africa using Epstein's plane. However, according to Davies, who was raped by Epstein multiple times after being recruited by Maxwell, quote, Clinton was a complete gentleman during the trip, and I saw absolutely no foul play involving him. On July 23, 2019, 2 weeks after his arrest, Epstein was found injured and semi-conscious at 1:30 a.m. on the floor of his cell, with marks and bruising around his neck. His cellmate, an ex-cop who was awaiting trial for 4 counts of murder, was questioned, but denied having any knowledge of what happened. Epstein survived but was placed on Arkancide watch. 6 days later, he was taken off of watch and placed in a special housing unit. His associates claimed that at the time he was in good spirits. On August 9, 2019, Epstein's cellmate was transferred out of the room, but he wasn't replaced. That night, the guards broke procedure for the special housing unit, which required them to check each inmate every 30 minutes. The 2 guards on duty allegedly both fell asleep, which is an obvious lie, and didn't check on him for over 3 hours. They later attempted to falsify records to hide this lapse in security. The 2 cameras in front of Epstein's cell malfunctioned that night, which is also an obvious lie. Epstein was found dead in his cell at 6:30 a.m. on August 10, 2019. But due to the completely obvious cover-up, literally anything could have happened. According to the autopsy, Epstein violently threw himself off the top bunk, which led to him sustaining multiple bone breaks in his neck, including his hyoid bone, which is sometimes a sign of hanging but is most commonly found in victims of murder by strangulation. On August 16, 2019, Barbara Sampson, the New York City medical examiner, ruled Epstein's death as suicide by hanging. Although it's my opinion that Epstein's death was almost certainly an orchestrated assassination, his trade was the blackmail of the most powerful and wealthy individuals in the world, Clinton among them. It could have been any of those individuals or one of the multiple intelligence agencies that wanted him gone. That being said, it's my opinion that Epstein's death, as it pertains to the Clintons, is highly suspicious. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you got through this whole thing, you're amazing. We're finally at the end. Videos like this sometimes take days and days to get approved by YouTube. So if you want to support the channel further than watching the videos, liking, commenting, and subscribing, and want to see exclusive and early videos, Patreon is the best way to do so. And the link is down in the description. Massive shout out to all my patrons for all the support and for just holding me down while I took months and months to make this video. You guys are my all-star Gemini twins. Follow me on Instagram and X, and I'll see you all again very, very soon.